It was supposed to be an ordinary morning. The sun had just risen, painting the streets with soft light, and the city was slowly waking up. People hurried to their jobs, cars lined up at the traffic lights, and shops were opening their shutters. In the middle of this daily rhythm, a young black woman named Maya was driving to her workplace. She was calm, listening to music, and planning her day in her mind. To her, it was just another morning, but fate had decided to place her in a moment that would change not only her day but also the life of someone who thought he had untouchable power. A police siren suddenly echoed behind her. Maya's heart skipped for a second, as it does for most people when they hear that sound. She looked at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. She had her seatbelt on. She had stopped properly at every light. Still, she pulled her car to the side of the road, the way every responsible citizen would do. She rolled down her window and placed her hands calmly on the steering wheel, showing respect and following the rules. The officer walked toward her car with heavy steps, sunglasses, hiding his eyes, and a posture that spoke more of authority than duty. He leaned into the window and asked for her license and registration. Maya nodded politely and handed them over without hesitation. She expected him to glance at them and return them quickly, the way it usually goes when someone is checked without reason. But instead his voice grew cold. "Where are you headed?" he asked sharply, though the question sounded less like curiosity and more like suspicion. Maya, still calm, replied softly, "I'm on my way to work." The officer gave her a long look, as if her answer wasn't enough. He flipped through her documents slowly, pausing as if searching for something wrong. His tone turned harsher. "Are you sure this is your car? People like you don't usually drive something this nice." The words stung, not because Maya doubted herself, but because of the way he said "people like you." She felt the hidden meaning. She had faced it before in different forms, and though she stayed silent, her eyes met his firmly. The officer smirked, clearly enjoying the discomfort he thought he was causing. Time stretched on. He asked her for proof again, though she had already given every document. He asked the same questions again and again, as if trying to trap her in a mistake. A few people passing by slowed down to watch. One man even stopped at the corner, pretending to look at his phone but clearly paying attention to what was happening. The scene was becoming larger than just a traffic stop. Maya breathed deeply. She knew raising her voice would only make things worse. So she chose a different kind of strength, the kind that comes from patience and calmness. When the officer asked again for her license, she kept her tone steady. "Officer, you already have it in your hand." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. But it carried something stronger than anger. It carried confidence. The officer didn't like it. He leaned closer, his shadow falling across her face. "Do you want to make this harder for yourself?" he asked. Maya blinked slowly, then asked in a calm but clear voice, "May I have your badge number, please?" That question flipped the air around them. For the first time, the officer shifted slightly, as if caught off guard. The crowd nearby seemed to lean in. A man across the street raised his phone higher. Another woman walking past stopped completely, pretending to tie her shoe, but her eyes stayed locked on the scene. The officer forced a laugh, trying to brush it off, but the tension had changed. The balance of control was no longer only in his hands. Maya didn't raise her tone, didn't move an inch out of line, but her words had placed the officer under the same spotlight he had tried to place her under. Inside, Maya's heart beat faster than she showed. She had been here before, in situations where silence seemed safer, but this time felt different. Maybe it was the crowd watching. Maybe it was the man recording. Or maybe it was simply that she was tired of letting moments like this pass without question. The officer kept her documents, longer than necessary, pacing by his car and back again as if thinking. But every step he took was being observed. Every word he spoke was being caught by the ears of witnesses. And though he didn't know it yet, one of those witnesses was recording the entire encounter clearly enough that the world would soon see it. Minutes dragged on, but Maya stayed composed. She didn't let frustration show on her face. She didn't argue. She knew that her strength in this moment was not in matching his aggression, but in showing the calm dignity he lacked. And while the officer thought he was the one holding power, What he didn't realize was that he had already lost the one thing that mattered most: control of the narrative. As he finally tossed her documents back and waved her off with an annoyed gesture, thinking he had ended it on his terms, Maya simply took them, nodded once, and drove away. The crowd slowly dispersed, but whispers filled the air. People talked to each other quietly, shaking their heads at what they had just witnessed. The man who had recorded everything checked his phone carefully, making sure the footage was saved. Maya's car moved forward, back into the stream of morning traffic, but her thoughts were heavy. She had walked through that storm without losing herself. She didn't know yet how important her patience had been or how far this moment would travel. She only knew she had stood her ground, not with anger, not with loudness, but with calm strength. And somewhere behind her, the officer walked back to his patrol car, unaware that his morning choice, his careless words, and his arrogance had just set in motion a chain of events that would soon expose him in a way he could never have imagined. The days after the traffic stop moved slowly, but the memory stayed fresh in Maya's mind. She tried to bury herself in her work, answering calls, handling reports, keeping her usual calm, but every now and then the officer's smirk would flash across her thoughts. She didn't regret staying composed, yet a small part of her wondered if her calmness had even mattered. Would anything change? Would his arrogance go unnoticed again like so many times before? But while she asked herself those quiet questions, the city was already buzzing in a way she didn't know. The man who had recorded everything had uploaded the video to social media the very same afternoon. At first it was just another clip, in a sea of content, but within hours it spread like fire. The officer's words, the way he mocked her, the tone he used, it all struck a nerve. People shared it, commented on it, debated it, and by nightfall it was everywhere. Maya's phone began to light up with messages from friends and coworkers. "Is this you? I saw you online. Are you okay?" Some sent words of support, others sent screenshots. She opened the video herself and for the first time watched the moment from the outside. She saw herself sitting in the car, calm and steady. She saw the officer towering with false confidence. She saw the crowd, the people who had stopped, the phones recording. And suddenly she realized it wasn't just her who had carried the weight of that moment. The city had carried it with her. The officer, on the other hand, had no idea how fast things were turning. He walked into the station the next morning as if nothing had happened, laughing with colleagues, sipping his coffee. He had faced complaints before and brushed them off easily. In his mind, this was no different. Maybe a few angry comments online, maybe a quick note in a file that no one ever looked at. He thought his badge and connections would protect him, like they always had. But by midday, whispers started in the precinct. Officers gathered in corners, holding their phones, watching the same clip over and over again. Some shook their heads, some avoided saying anything at all. A few even laughed nervously, but the tension was clear. This was bigger than usual. This wasn't just a complaint filed quietly in a drawer. This was public. This was everywhere. When Maya stepped into her office later that week, she carried herself as she always did, professional, composed. She wasn't one for drama, and she wasn't the type to celebrate someone else's downfall. Still, she couldn't ignore the shift in the air. Colleagues looked at her with a new kind of respect. Some even nodded quietly as she passed by. She didn't fully understand it yet, but people had seen the way she handled herself in that video. To them, she wasn't just a woman who had been stopped unfairly. She was someone who had stood tall without raising her voice. Someone who had shown grace where others would have broken down. Meanwhile, the officer was called in. At first, it was routine, a supervisor asking for his side of the story. He shrugged it off, gave short answers, smirked even. But the supervisor's tone was different this time. Serious, tense. He was told Internal Affairs would be reviewing the case. For the first time in years, a chill ran through him. Internal Affairs wasn't the kind of place you wanted your name mentioned. As the officer sat in the waiting room of the investigation wing, tapping his foot, he still carried that air of arrogance. He whispered to another officer nearby, "It'll blow over like always." But his eyes betrayed him. They darted around nervously, waiting for someone to call his name. And then the door opened. The head of Internal Affairs stepped in, holding a file in her hands. The officer froze. The smirk vanished from his face. His mouth went dry. Because standing in front of him was Maya, the same woman he had mocked, the same woman he thought he had intimidated. Only now she wasn't behind the wheel of a car. She was standing tall, with authority that didn't need a badge to shout. She didn't need to prove who she was. The title she carried and the respect in the room already did that for her. For a long second, silence filled the air. The officer looked at her as if the ground beneath him had given way. Maya's eyes met his, calm but unshaken, the same way they had on the street. But here the power had shifted completely. The tables had turned in a way he never could have imagined. She placed the file gently on the desk, not rushing, not raising her tone. She simply said, "Shall we begin, Ahoy?" Officer swallowed hard. For the first time he had no quick response, no sharp remark, no false confidence to lean on. He realized too late that the very person he tried to belittle was now the one holding every card. And as the door closed behind them, the rest of the station whispered quietly, waiting to see what would happen next. The room was quiet, yet the silence felt heavier than any noise could have been. The officer sat in the chair across from Maya, his back stiff, his hands fidgeting just slightly on the table. A week ago he had leaned into her car window with arrogance, acting as though nothing could touch him. Now he couldn't even meet her eyes without feeling the weight of his own actions. Maya placed the file on the table, opened it carefully, and slid a few printed pages forward. They were still images, screenshots from the viral video. The officer saw himself in those frozen frames, his posture towering, his face twisted with mockery, his gestures pointing sharply at Maya in her car. He saw himself the way the world now saw him, not as a protector of the law, but as a man abusing the uniform he wore. Maya's tone was calm, almost too calm for him to handle. "Do you recognize this?" she asked, pointing to the images. He cleared his throat, tried to force a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Looks like a traffic stop. People blow these things out of proportion online." Maya didn't respond to the excuse. Instead, she clicked the remote, and the full video began to play on the screen in the corner of the room. The audio filled the space, the sharpness of his voice, the unnecessary repetition of questions the moment he mocked her. The officer shifted in his seat, hearing it not as something he had said casually, but as something now captured forever. When the clip ended, Maya leaned forward slightly. "Do you believe this represents the values of this department?" He tried to answer quickly, but his words stumbled. It was just a misunderstanding. She was nervous. I was doing my job. People misread situations all the time. Maya's expression didn't change. She had heard excuses like this before countless times. But now the difference was clear. This time, she wasn't listening as a victim. She was listening as the one holding authority. Her questions were not emotional. They were precise, professional, and sharp enough to leave no escape. She opened another file, this one thicker. "This isn't the first complaint filed against you, is it?" The officer froze. His lips parted, but no words came out. Inside the folder were records, complaints from past years, small incidents brushed aside, moments that had been ignored or excused. On their own, they looked like isolated shadows. But together, under the bright light of this investigation, they formed a pattern too strong to deny. Maya read them aloud slowly, one by one. Each time she spoke a line, the officer's shoulders sank lower. Each time she paused, the silence between her words made the weight heavier. By the time she closed the file, the air in the room felt suffocating for him. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, trying to keep his composure. But he couldn't stop the realization that hit him harder than any punishment ever could. The woman he had once seen as powerless now held the power to end his career. Maya finally spoke again, her tone steady. "This isn't just about you and me. This is about the uniform you wear, the trust the public is supposed to have. Do you understand that? The officer's throat was dry. For the first time in years, he didn't have a comeback. He nodded slightly, his arrogance completely gone. Across the hallway, other officers moved quietly, pretending not to listen but unable to ignore the tension. Some respected Maya deeply, and seeing her in this role only made their respect grow. Others who had looked away from misconduct in the past now felt uneasy, wondering if their own choices would one day be called out in the same way. Hours passed, the questioning digging deeper into reports, procedures, and behavior. The officer realized the walls were closing in. This wasn't a routine check. This wasn't going to disappear. His old methods of escaping accountability had no place here. When the session ended, Maya closed the file and stood up. Her words were simple, but they carried finality. "You'll be notified of the findings soon." The officer left the room slower than he had entered, his steps heavy. For the first time, the badge on his chest felt like a burden instead of a shield. Maya remained in the room for a moment after he left, her hand resting lightly on the file. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't celebrating. Justice wasn't about revenge for her. It was about responsibility. And though part of her felt the satisfaction of balance being restored, another part felt the weight of what it meant to hold others accountable. Outside the building, the city continued to talk. The video still spread. News outlets picked it up and community voices grew louder. To the public, it wasn't just about one officer. It was about the system he represented. And in the middle of it all, Maya had become the quiet figure who showed what dignity looked like under pressure, and what strength looked like when finally given the chance to be heard. The officer drove home that evening in silence, the same way Maya once had after their encounter. But unlike her, he carried no calm, only fear, and the knowledge that the woman he had once mocked had the final word on his future. And deep down, for the first time in his career, he understood. Actions, no matter how small they seemed in the moment, always carried consequences. The report didn't stay behind closed doors for long. Internal affairs worked quickly, and within a week the department had no choice but to release a statement. They announced that the officer was under full investigation, suspended until further notice. It was a small line in the press release, but the city read it like thunder. The name was clear. The video was still fresh in everyone's mind. There was no hiding anymore. For years, the officer had walked into the station with his head high, throwing casual remarks, carrying himself like no rule could touch him. Now, when he stepped through the doors, conversations fell silent. Colleagues who once laughed at his jokes suddenly avoided his eyes. Some shook their heads when he passed. Others whispered quietly in corners. The badge that had always given him power now felt like a spotlight burning against him. The worst part wasn't just the silence at work. It was the world outside. Neighbors who used to nod politely now shut their doors faster. The grocery store felt like a stage, eyes following him with judgment. Even his family, who had once defended him through small complaints, sat in heavy silence at the dinner table. His children asked questions he couldn't answer. His wife looked at him differently, not with anger, but with disappointment that cut deeper than anything else. And while his world crumbled, Maya's life took on a different tone. She never sought attention. She had always preferred quiet work, letting results speak louder than her presence. But now, she became a symbol, without trying. Community leaders spoke about her composure in interviews. Strangers sent letters of support to her office. Her colleagues, even those who had once underestimated her, now looked at her with respect that went beyond her title. Yet Maya carried it all with humility. She didn't celebrate the officer's downfall. She didn't hold press conferences or give speeches. She simply continued her work, reviewing files, meeting with teams, carrying herself with the same calm dignity she had shown in that traffic stop. To her, this wasn't about glory. It was about responsibility. But one moment stayed with her. She remembered the way the officer had leaned into her car, smirking, confident that nothing she said would matter. She remembered how small he wanted her to feel. And now she thought of how small he looked sitting across from her in that interview room. Not because she had made him small, but because the truth had finally caught up to him. The officer, meanwhile, grew restless. He tried to call in favors, reaching out to people he thought would protect him, but one by one doors closed. Those who once stood by him now stepped back, unwilling to be dragged into the storm. For the first time, he felt alone. Not because people hated him, but because his own actions had left him without allies. At night, he replayed the video again, hearing his own voice echoing back at him. What once felt like harmless arrogance now sounded cruel, even to his own ears. He saw Maya's calm face in the driver's seat, her steady hands on the wheel, her clear request for his badge number. And he saw himself. The smirk, the mocking words, the posture of superiority. He realized the contrast was undeniable. He wasn't the strong one in that encounter. She was. Meanwhile, Internal Affairs moved forward with its findings. The file against him grew thicker, not just with the viral incident, but with past complaints resurfacing. What had once been overlooked now carried weight. Patterns of behavior became clear, and each line in the file was another crack in the shield he thought would protect him forever. Maya reviewed the documents with the same professionalism she carried in all her work. To her, it wasn't personal. It was about the bigger picture. Every case mattered. Every person deserved fairness. But she couldn't ignore that this case, this man, had once tried to strip her of dignity she refused to surrender. And now, the very system he thought he owned was holding him accountable, with her as its voice. The city followed the story closely. News outlets showed clips of the video alongside updates from the investigation. People debated, argued, and rallied. For many, Maya became proof that patience and strength could shift even the most unbalanced situations. She had not shouted, had not cursed, had not fought with anger. She had met arrogance with calmness, and won. The officer's hearing drew closer. He sat in his small apartment late one night, staring at the notice. He thought about the years he had spent in uniform, the moments he had taken pride in, the times he had felt untouchable. And then he thought of Maya, the quiet way she had asked for his badge number, the calm way she had watched him in the office, the authority in her voice when she said, "Shall we begin?" For the first time in his life, he admitted something to himself. She wasn't the problem. He was. Maya, preparing her final review before the hearing, paused for a moment by her office window. The city stretched before her, lights flickering in the distance. She thought about how easily things could have been different, if she had shouted, if she had broken under pressure, if no one had recorded the moment. But she didn't. She stayed true to herself. And now, the truth was shining too brightly to be hidden. The storm was not yet over. The hearing was still to come. But the outcome was already clear to anyone watching closely. The officer's arrogance had brought him to this point, and Maya's quiet strength had carried her to a place he could never reach. The same street where he once believed he had all the power was now just a memory. And the woman he tried to belittle had become the symbol of everything he thought he stood above: justice, dignity, and strength. The day of the hearing arrived. The air inside the hall was tense, filled with the quiet shuffle of papers, the heavy sound of chairs moving, and the low murmur of voices trying not to rise above whispers. Reporters waited outside, cameras ready, because this was no longer just an internal matter. It had become a case the entire city wanted to see resolved. The officer entered with slow steps. His once confident stride was gone, replaced by a nervous stiffness. He kept his eyes low, but every so often he looked around the room as if searching for someone, maybe for support, maybe for sympathy, but found only silence. He knew everyone was waiting to hear the verdict, but he already felt the weight of what was coming. Then Maya walked in. She didn't need an introduction. Everyone in the room knew who she was by now. She carried no arrogance, no performance, just a quiet authority that drew attention without effort. She took her seat calmly, her file in front of her, her hands steady. To her, this wasn't about triumph or revenge. It was about truth. The session began with evidence being presented. The video played again, the same recording that had been watched millions of times. The officer couldn't bear to look at the screen. Hearing his own voice echoing through the room made him shrink further into his chair. He tried to justify himself when given the chance, but each excuse fell apart under questioning. His words sounded weak, empty compared to the clarity of the video and the record of past complaints. When it was Maya's turn to speak, the room grew silent. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize the event. She simply recounted what happened that morning. The stop, the repeated demands, the mocking tone the moment she asked for his badge number. Her words were steady, factual, but each sentence carried the weight of dignity he had tried to take from her. "Respect is not a favor," she said quietly, looking directly at the panel. "It is the foundation of this badge. When that respect is broken, trust is lost. And when trust is lost, the whole system suffers." The panel listened closely. Some nodded slightly, others wrote notes quickly, but all of them felt the truth in her words. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the edge of the table. For years he had walked freely after moments like this. But now, with every word she spoke, he felt the walls of accountability close tighter. When the session ended, the panel withdrew to deliberate. The room emptied slowly, but the tension lingered. Outside reporters pushed forward, waiting for answers. The officer sat alone, his head in his hands, knowing deep down what was coming. Maya, meanwhile, stood by the window, calm as ever. She didn't celebrate, didn't smile, but she carried the quiet strength of someone who had done what needed to be done. Finally, the panel returned. The verdict was read aloud in clear, steady words. The officer was found guilty of misconduct, suspended permanently, and stripped of his position. Years of arrogance and abuse had caught up to him in one undeniable moment. He stood frozen, the badge he once wore with pride now nothing more than a memory. The room stayed silent for a heartbeat, then filled with whispers. Some sighed in relief, others nodded firmly. Outside, the news spread quickly, headlines flashing across screens, voices rising in conversation. The city had its answer. The officer left the hall with slow steps, his career behind him, his reputation shattered. He no longer carried the weight of authority, only the burden of regret. For the rest of his life, he would remember the face of the woman he had once mocked, the calm strength that had undone him without a single shout. Maya, on the other hand, walked out with the same grace she had carried from the beginning. She didn't seek cameras, didn't give speeches. She simply returned to her office and continued her work. For her, justice wasn't a stage, it was a duty. But her story didn't stay small. Communities began to speak of her as a symbol. Schools used her example to teach about dignity and courage. Organizations quoted her words about respect and trust. She had not planned to become a public figure, yet her quiet strength had made her one. In the weeks that followed, life moved on. The city faced new challenges, new stories. But the memory of that traffic stop, the video, the investigation, and the final hearing stayed alive. It reminded people that power could be abused, but also that it could be held accountable. One evening, Maya drove home from work, passing the very street where it had all begun. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow on the road. She slowed, for a moment remembering the siren, the officer's voice, the crowd watching. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet it was only weeks past. She took a deep breath, her hands steady on the wheel, and drove on. She hadn't just survived that moment, she had transformed it. What was meant to humiliate her had instead revealed her strength. What was meant to silence her had given her a voice that echoed far beyond her own life. And though she would never say it out loud, deep in her heart she knew. Sometimes the quietest resistance is the loudest victory.